in this particular instance, the price discovery process is this kind of opaque process that actually is what determines the value of a good. It's not related to the fact that I put in X number of hours to create a
me as
certain
a
product.
buyer, I don't really give a shit about any of that. It's how much do
Yeah,
I need
exactly.
that?
It's how much do you want
do I
it?
need your widget? How much do I
Yeah.
want it? How much money have I got? How rich do I feel right now? Do I
Right,
feel
right.
rich or do I feel poor?
Take me to the ocean, take me to the sea, wash away my worries, let my soul be free. Take me to the ocean, take me to the sea, wash away my worries, let my soul be free.
Hello world, I'm Max. Back in IRL, I go by Curtis. Welcome to another episode of the State Copy Podcast. As always, I'll remind you to review episode 0 and its appended segments for terms, conditions, and disclosures applicable to the entirety of this content. Thank you. Well, hey everybody. Welcome to another episode of the show. Today I have Hirsch Goal on again for I guess the second time on the show, and I asked him prior to meeting what he'd like to talk about. He said Marxism. I have learned a really neat thing you can do in podcasting is to create a preface where you can insert thoughts you had in reflection, upon reflection of a conversation with somebody. And that's what I'm going to continue doing. I feel like it's kind of a cheat in podcasting. I'd recommend any newbies try this. Hirsch is a brilliant guy who has studied this topic a lot more deeply than I have. And I think going into it, I spent about a week just finding rich dialogue on the subject. And for some reason, both times I've met with Hirsch, didn't get all the sleep I wanted. I went into it and I'm drinking a coffee, chugging it the whole time to try and get myself awake. And it's mostly because I think I was trying to get myself in a mind state that was really productive. And I did the opposite prior to the conversation. But yeah, I don't know. I would say the big thoughts that come to me as I'm listening to this is I wish I'd shut up more and just let Hirsch talk because he knows more about it than I do. And I think this is a really cool topic that more people should think about because there's some profound implications of how we govern ourselves and the different models we choose. And while there is thousands of hours and books on this topic available to choose from, I was thinking, like, what could we add? What's a new thing? I don't know that we, I don't think Hirsch, I think it's fair to say upon reflection that I don't think Hirsch is trying to make a case, and I'm definitely not trying to make a case that we are the foremost experts on this topic. We're just two thoughtful humans talking about something really interesting to us. And if anything, I hope you'll just take that from it. And please enjoy the show. Leave your comments, questions, and Hirsch and I might meet up again and talk about this again in the future because it's just so big. It's such a big thought. How to let markets govern themselves is just it's huge. It's awesome. I really dug this conversation. I'm glad that you're here with me to experience it. Thank you so much. I'm going to shut up and let us talk. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the State Copy Podcast. I have for you our guest today. Dr. Hirsch Goal is returned for part 2, a continuation, or, well, I think we're going to talk about new stuff this time. How you doing, Hirsch?
I'm doing well, Curtis. How you doing?
Oh, I'm good, man. Um, Last time we talked, I think we dove right into a whole bunch of. I think I provided a little bit of our kind of like our professional background, like how I knew you.
Yes.
Yeah, but I didn't really give you a chance to really tell me much about your story. And today we're going to talk about Marxism. And and I asked you. I said, "Well, what's a cool? What's something you like to talk about? What's on your mind?" And you said Marxism, which is a heavy topic. And I never really appreciated how heavy until I sat down and tried to prepare for doing a podcast with somebody about it. It is like the heaviest. I mean, it delves into some things that are super heavy. So I would like to give you a chance to kind of tell the audience why you picked that, and just a little bit about sort of your story up before Phillips.
Sure. Yeah. So, first of all, it's great to be back, Curtis. I wish we were in person, but we'll do the online thing. I think why Marxism? So I would say over the last, it's honestly been a couple of years since I looked more deeply into Marxism, but I spent a few years looking into it, studying it, trying to understand it, and I feel in a way that I never had a chance, or I haven't spent the time to almost debrief some of the things that I learned and the trajectory that took me on. So that's kind of the short answer. I think the longer answer is that, when I was in the medical education system and learning to become a physician, there was a lot about the field that I challenged or tried to understand how it worked, and in doing so challenged how it worked, which helped me understand it better, right? So, for example, why is technology uptake so slow in medicine? Or why did I often feel that the incentives between the people who were providing care may have been different from patients? And, it actually led me to kind of explore many aspects of society. And one of the things that came out of it was, at the time, I had a general feeling that the capitalist system, and we'll get more into terms and definitions and whether these things even exist later, but I felt that it was incompatible with the practice of medicine in a way, right? This is at the time. And so that sort of led me to trying to explore what are the counter kind of theories or counter narratives to capitalism. And of course we know that Karl Marx is kind of the intellect who has written a great deal about it. He has 3 volumes that are essentially a criticism of the capitalist mode of production. And so that really led me to Marxism. And I think at the same time, I had this general sense or idea that I was searching for almost a theory of everything type of way of looking at the world. And again, this is at the time. I no longer believe in such fantasies. But so that really took me to it, and I wanted to read the text itself as well. So I didn't end up reading all 3 volumes, but I read the first volume in quite depth, and that was also the most. I believe it was the only complete work that he did. The other 2 were put together from his writings by Engels, and so. I've been on a journey from Marx to, wherever else it's taken me. And it's been a while since I did that deep dive into it, but I thought it could be fun and interesting to talk about it and see where we land.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say you were kind of looking for a theory of everything, because it really does. I mean, as I sort of, I think the topic, you kind of, you think about all the surface things about what you learned, like, I'm thinking middle school social studies, like why communism failed, and then you go back and you hear about these figures, and you hear that it's based on this work by Karl Marx, and you kind of build this idea of, okay, yeah, it kind of breaks innovation. But then you don't realize how deep this topic is about how how value is determined, and how, all of these dynamics that I'm sure you're going to dig into, and how markets actually function, and then the ethics involved of sort of inserting yourself in the natural order of things to try and make things more even for people you think are kind of losing. It's and it's like it does start to turn into theories of everything when you start diving into it.
And I mean, I think perhaps in general humans may have a tendency to try to seek such a explanation for the world, and I think at once the world is much more complicated and also simpler. It's kind of this dichotomy, or this contradiction. But so I think it's really important also to understand, or try to understand, the world as it exists. We sometimes have to theorize, so we could say that the economy as it exists is theorized as and being described as capitalism. And I say that because, I think it's much more complicated than that, and I don't think you can describe it in one word, let's say. But in order to understand that, I think you have to understand criticisms of it, and counter theories, and different angles of looking at it, because I think that solidifies our knowledge and helps us understand, how the world works.
Right. Well, and capitalism has problems. I think I went into this actually. I went into preparing for talking to you about this, thinking, well, I think I kind of have a feeling I know how this conversation is going to go. And then in looking at the material, I'm like, well, actually, this does make you ask a lot of questions, about, I think that's putting the cart before the horse. Let's, what you just described is kind of how it grabbed your attention. And now, because everything, like, I swear from day to day, I think radically different about something. I had conviction about, because especially if you, and that's a superpower, if you let yourself be the type of person that can grow over time, and that can kind of let yourself evolve how you think about things. That means yesterday you might have thought something quite a bit different. So now let's walk through.
Can I just say something on that topic? Because that happens to me quite often, and I really do feel, though, that I'm at a point in my life where I almost feel like I know nothing, in the sense that, I've kind of questioned various ways of thinking that I've had in the past, and I've gone from one side to another side, and it really does make me feel that as I get older, I know less and less. So, perhaps I wish you talked to me about this a couple of years ago.
Well, I feel like life made such perfect sense back when I thought I had all the answers. And I think the progression you just described really eloquently captures aging and why it's so awesome. Like, aging really gets a horrible rap because, it's like the whole new universe expands before your eyes as you get older, and you think, oh, wait, I can zoom out a little bit from this thing, and holy shit, this thing's a lot bigger than I thought it was. Right. So, okay. So, idealist, or ideal, how do I want to say it? Just your younger self, who was
Yeah.
quite sure he knew all the answers. What did he think of Marxism on the first pass?
Okay, yeah. So my younger self felt that it was extremely important criticism of capitalism, and generally agreed with kind of much of that criticism. But my younger self was still, I think, wise enough to never describe itself as a Marxist or use any sort. And the reason why I say that is because I think that people will often they like to describe themselves and reduce
Yeah, they want
themselves
to
to a
party up.
term.
They want to get in their team, their
Yeah,
tribe.
and
Yeah,
and I think that, like, not only does that, it can be nice from the purposes of describing your political or economic beliefs. However, I also think that it keeps you trapped into them as well, because
yeah,
if you describe yourself as a Marxist, then you start to identify yourself in that way, right? And so I never described myself or identified in that way. I simply sought to learn about the theories espoused through Marxism to understand the world better. And so at the time, I would say that I think that I agreed with it more than I do now. But what is consistent and the same is that I think it's really important to explore it again to help us understand how the economy works in its current capacity, in its current form, understand maybe some of the challenges we might be having, and to try to understand where are the things that are incorrect about Marxism, or things that maybe don't explain things in the correct way.
sure. I mean, there's so many brilliant minds that in history got behind this and put their lives on the line
Yeah.
to protect it, to try it as a grand experiment. And there's something really beautiful about all of that. And it seems kind of you're just doing yourself such a disservice to just immediately dismiss something like that as that little chapter in social studies, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's even more of a disservice when we demonize work such as that, which I think in general we
Yeah.
have done. So is we almost it's perhaps not right now, but I think there have been times in American history where
McCarthy
it's
is, yeah.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
cancelable offense type of thing, right? And I think it certainly does a disservice, because it's better to just learn about it all be be critical of it, or be basically challenge it, rather than kind of ostracizing the work itself.
Yeah. Or go into it trying to prove it wrong without really knowing much about it.
Yeah.
So, give me an idea of your social pressures around you. Like, what was your childhood like? Like, your parents, were they supportive of you having very independent political views from them, or did they have like a political? Because I grew up in a
Yeah.
house where my dad would describe himself as a blind Democrat. He would just basically, he didn't need to know the issue. He didn't need to know. He just knew that one side was evil. Like, he was already in extreme popularism
Right.
when he
Right.
was, like when I was growing up. So my major, and I have a lot of respect for that man. Like, I was a guy who
Yeah,
just
of
really
course,
got
yeah.
along and loved my dad. And
Right.
that's what he said I should think, and it wasn't
Yeah.
ever, I never felt like pressure on it though. Like I was, and then now my mother she was raised in a family that, so her mom came from this sort of wealthy family that was well established early in America's
Yeah.
history. I can't remember what it was, but they were very conservative leaning, and
Oh, okay.
yeah, and then she in the 50s no, in the 40s, decided to hitch across the country to the West Coast, and she became a party communist. She joined the Communist Party somewhere on the West Coast. So that is, and I remember growing up where she would always be listening to like one of those little pocket radios, NPR. Okay. And she was one of those people who call in to NPR all the time.
Wow.
And so her daughters, you know, huge, like this topic really matters to parts of my family. But I didn't. Yep. And then I had this kind of, I had blind Democrat father who, you know, of course they got along kind of if you think about modern politics, but I never had a lot of pressure to, well, there was a few times where, I think it would have caused problems between me and my dad if I was for the Iraq war or something like that. Okay. You know what I mean? Like, so that's kind of where, but because we were pretty much aligned when I was younger, and now I would, because I've grown so much, like the same thing you described for yourself that I've done, I think all of it is pretty silly. The whole right, left in America, especially in American domestic politics, the left really loses me on economics. Right. Now that I have some understanding of it. So I think that's really important context before you listen to two dudes talk about something like this. Before we just start talking about Karl Marx and theories and stuff, you got to know the people, and you got to know kind of, it sounds like both the guest and the host of this conversation are I would say we're not very fixed in our thinking, and it matures all the time. So definitely. As an audience of this conversation, I would encourage you to not paint us in any type of box of how we think about this, because I think you'll see that it changes a lot as we move through the conversation. So,
do you want me to answer that just about my own political background? Okay. So I would say that. I did not grow up in a political household, and I guess just to be clear, how do we define politics? I mean, I kind of like the definition from the Sovereign Individual, which is essentially the social interactions and interplay around the making a government larger is kind of what their definition is. I mean, perhaps a little crass, but I like it in retrospect. But I didn't grow up very political at all. Is that what it is? Yeah.
I still haven't read that book. It's just about, it's two different takes on growing a government, or is it just sizing a government?
It's basically just the notion of a government becoming larger. And so the interplay around that. So you could say like, well, you've got Republicans and Democrats, and they're both trying to do that. Anyway.
Well, I feel like, okay, I want to get back to you finishing your thought there on your history, but I also want to say like, on like these days, especially as we approach sort of this fourth turning moment, like the 80-year cycle of I feel like we touched on that a little bit. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
we didn't really, we mentioned it, but yeah.
Okay.
Why don't you tell the audience briefly? Should we briefly just say what it is, or?
There's a couple authors authored a book in the mid '90s. I think Neil
Strauss, right? Strauss and Howe. Strauss and Howe.
Yes, I'm terrible with proper nouns. Leave it to the doctor to remember the names. I read that book. I would say just a few years ago, studying macro, it kept coming up with a bunch of people I could tell really had a good handle on what macro is, and they were all these people I was learning from kept referencing it. So I went back and I read it, and it's this whole idea of there being sort of archetypes of sort of cultural, of culture. And like these big events that happen in history, like World War II, tend to shape the people of a certain generation that are actually fighting the war and then coming home and having a whole bunch of children and then raising them as like a whole culture together, tend to raise their children with similar values. They all kind of align on how they raise them and what they want them to focus on in school and all of those things. And then the knock-on effects of a bunch of children raised that way then raise their children to be the boomers. And then the boomers raise their children to be Gen X and the millennials. And so there's kind of like there's this rolling effect as you study history where if it doesn't exactly repeat itself, it really rhymes. And then there's a whole bunch of, when you overlay that with how global reserve currencies and global markets and economic business cycle that stretches out for generationally, you see it sort of lined right up with these fourth turnings. And Ray Dalio's got an excellent story where he describes the rise and fall of nations, and he touches on the second part of what I just said around the global economy and how it rolls along the same archetypal cycle that we got that are almost like the seasons. It's, and there's 4 of them. And it's a really interesting, well thought out, well respected, sort of universally. Like, I haven't heard anybody who read that book and said, that's stupid. Like, nobody says that. And reading it, there is a lot of stuff that makes a lot of sense in that. And I'm trying to remember why I mentioned it, to circle back to that. What was the context for fourth turning?
Yeah, so we were talking, I was about to talk about my kind of political or lack of political background. We started to define a little bit around politics, and then you brought up the fourth turning.
Oh yeah. I was trying to say that around how sovereign individual defines politics as just being about like growing government larger, but here in the fourth turning moment, it's also how we divide culture. It's like, I think when I picture, like if I pictured a balloon filled with all of the unique ways everybody thinks, like if I took 7 billion people and I put their essence in a balloon and I said, this balloon can have unlimited nuance, like everybody thinks slightly different things. In a fourth turning, I feel like somebody squeezes that balloon right down the center into a barbell. Right. We sort of culturally get divided into these 2 buckets that are kind of at each other's throats. They just have to be opposite every argument. So it stretches beyond thing. And the reason to say all that is because it spans beyond just how big should the government be. It also comes down to identity, cultural things, whether I should be whose team am I on? That's what you see around you everywhere now. Right. It's affecting marriages and families and stuff like that. People won't let their kids marry people on the other side of the aisle and all that. Yeah. And it's fourth turning stuff. Every 80 years, we kind of go through this. And that's why I mentioned that. But going
it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's all I wanted to say about that. And then if you want to comment, cool. But then let's take it back to where you were kind of exploring how you developed your own sense of politics.
Yeah, and maybe I should just say it's possible that I'm misremembering the definition that they give in the sovereign
Sovereign
individual. But
individual.
yeah, I'll put that aside. Maybe one comment on the fourth turning is that I have not read it, but as I understand it, and I've listened to the authors speak about it, it's a way of looking at the world through the lens of demographic shifts, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and in a sense, it is a theory of everything through the lens of large scale demographic shifts that, in their view, drive, you know, politics and economics and all of these disciplines that affect our lives. But to the kind of describe my political upbringing, I think so. We didn't. I grew up in Canada, and I would say generally, from the standpoint of party affiliation or anything like that, this was not a topic at the dinner table or something we discussed. But even though that was the case, there is, I think, I would describe the politics of a Canadian, if I can generalize it in that way, as basically.
Please, and all we know is the South Park. You're the half a
I
head
know,
people.
yeah. Well, it's not much better because it's essentially a feeling of superiority towards Americans.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I
This
mean,
is
just
this
to
is
put
great
it bluntly
insight.
and honestly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
basic.
yeah, yeah.
So like like just take the Iraq War for example. So Canadians
Yeah.
were extremely proud about the fact that they didn't join or didn't kind of participate in that war, and basically they just view themselves as kind of superior. I mean, I don't know what else to say. So it's so as
Well, I
opposed
will
to there
say this
being
about
yeah, yeah,
Canadians. I will
yeah,
say that they don't come off at they're brilliant at masking that superiority complex. I feel like, and they're
yeah.
like most Americans just think of Canadians as sort of wacky, friendly. You know,
And of course, and it is true, and it's not everybody, and it doesn't define everything, but there is a general sense, in my opinion, of that. But and that drives the politics, and so I would say if you were to use more kind of general terminology or modern terminology, they're often seen as being left of Americans, right? And so,
okay.
for example, like I said, most Canadians oppose the Iraq War, and you can think of issue after issue, and they're going to identify more on the left spectrum. So I think that it is fair to say that that very much colored my as a child, because you take those things for granted, right? When there's no debate around them, these things are taken for granted. Whereas in the U.S., you actually have more of extremes, and issues are debated in a way that in Canada you can often see there's more harmony around some of these issues and agreement towards the left side.
Got
Does
it.
that make sense? And so that
Yeah.
I have, that certainly colored my politics growing up. But I think in moving to the U.S., I was a high school student at the time. I've run through the gamut of kind of exploring all sides of the political spectrum, and I think I identify with what you said earlier, which is that today I don't identify with any of it. I simply try to understand it, and there may be a certain issue where perhaps I'm in agreement with one side or the other, but it's secondary. I would say that I'm very non-political in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But thoughtful about politics, and like maybe in the past, I feel like I was super political when I was younger. Like I felt like I would spend and I grew a lot through that. I spent
Right.
talking about the Iraq War. I remember getting into arguments because I was very against it. I grew up in
Me
blind
too.
Democrat house, and
Yeah.
and I And it just seemed so illogical to me, to like the whole premise of it. And it seemed like a massive overreaction that was going to be much more expensive than everybody says in lives and in money.
Right.
And it turns out I was totally right about everything. No, but I mean, in the moment, I was a 20-something-year-old kid, getting into arguing matches in my buddy's backyard at his barbecue, where he was, living in Arizona. It has turned into sort of a purplish state, but it was very red when I got here. Yeah. And so it was very right-leaning, and I felt like kind of an alien in my early 20s, before I was, while I still kind of thought all of this bickering mattered. And I remember times we got into it so heated over Iraq that, people said shit that was mean to each other. Went home. I'm not going to call him. I'm not going over to another barbecue there for at least till next month. But no, taking the way, passionately arguing something you don't really fully understand. Yeah. Like only a 20-something-year-old can. Like I remember, like I definitely went through that phase, And
me too. Certainly.
Right. And then it was like, and that kind of went on. I think through my 30s, I got to where I was more educated, and so I was even a little bit more, if I'm honest, kind of arrogant about it. Like, we're not gonna talk about this because, we both know.
Right. Yeah.
You're fucking crazy. Like that. I think everybody goes through that phase. And then I went through, COVID and divorce and being in my 40s and a bunch of other things and being a father. And I was just like, oh, none of this shit is like none of my opinions about this affect the outcomes at all.
Right.
So these arguing.
Nobody's calling you up and asking you what you think about it.
Yeah. How did that debate work out with you and your friend last night? Because we need to get those results tallied. Nobody cares about any of that. And it's like, these days, as I've spent a lot of time thinking about like how the mind works, and I'm doing like my passion project is around developing AI stuff, and I start thinking about how the human mind works from an engineering perspective. It occurs to me that most people spend an awful lot of time on this type of thought. Like it fills their mind a lot. And when I think about that as an engineer, I go, well, if I wanted to optimize that mind so it could think about more creatively, or if it could, if I wanted a mind to be freed up to learn a lot of things, I would be like, I need to find all the malware and close that and make sure it can't spawn new copies. And it really is that type of bickering match. It really does equate to malware to me, because everybody who is so consumed by it, they are in those arguing matches in a backyard, or with their children or their spouse, and they're thinking about rude things that they said as a result of this bickering match over a thing. We're all told you have this civic duty. Like if you are a serious person, if you are a person who cares and is thankful for, let's say, the citizenship they hold, you will take that as a responsibility to heart, and you will invest all of the time needed to really understand the issues of your time, so that you will do that very important voting thing. And I realized at the mid-40s, I was like, well, and I'll give my friend credit for this, because I actually think credit is just an awful concept we need to evolve past. But whoever thought of it, it was brilliant. my good buddy that I was describing arguing the Iraq war with, I just, and I think I may have mentioned this to you before, our agreement.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, him and I live in the same county in the state we live in, and we voted party line opposite each other for 20 years, 18 years.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, all of our responsibility, all of this obsessing over this, and all of this time in our minds that has been spent studying all of this shit, we've been canceling each other out for 18 years. It's like, if we just don't vote, the system is totally...
It'll be the same.
No integrity has been lost. And nobody can blame us for being apathetic because we didn't do it. We went and found a loving friendship.
That's hilarious,
Yeah. Do you realize that is the answer? Like, everybody's like, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve this problem? Like, if you could just get somebody who is a party line opposite voter to you in your county to punch out at the same time in like a loving way where you build like, you start hanging out and you start joining hobbies with somebody who used to be your enemy.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Suddenly those people are friends.
Yeah.
And then they become in the middle sort of a voting group of themselves that might just actually look at the nuance of all these things. I don't know. That's a hell of a tangent.
No, I mean, I for sure agree. Like I used to say to I guess as I was learning this stuff myself, is that people are more important than their beliefs, right? And I think it's just important to be detached from your beliefs, because otherwise they can take over, right?
Yeah,
and drive,
well said.
I think, negative behaviors.
Yeah, and those relationships, those people, are the ones you're going to go that might look after your kid while you're doing, you know what I mean? Like, that's so much more important than these political things. I think it's important to kind of pay attention, and it's really interesting. Like, I still will pay attention, but when it's just a bickering match over like whether people are allowed to use this word or that word and all that, that's just a lot of silliness, you know? But
agreed.
I think now we are ready to talk about Marxism.
Let's
now
do
you
it.
know a little bit more about who you're talking to. So the first book, as I understand it, was heavy critique, heavy like pointing out. Now, I haven't read any of the books, and my jam for learning is podcast. So I went and I watched, Lex Friedman did a whole series on Marxism. He had a few. And I told you about a couple that I watched. And I want to let you tell me, though, before I take up all the air. Like, so first book, your impressions, like, and kind of a summary for people who didn't read it. Like, what'd you take away from it?
Well, I think I might start off by saying that we have to consider the way that the book is, the type of analysis and the type of critique that it is. And so Marx uses a technique that he calls historical materialism, or I can't remember if he calls it or we call it that, after the fact. And what this approach is it basically starts with the material reality, so the world as it exists. It then tries to go deeper to find any sort of conceptual foundation, so basically abstracts the material reality to then look at the concepts that might underlie it, and then tries to come back up now using those established concepts to now explain that material reality. And it's a dialectic approach in that it often tries to look at the dual qualities of things, to study them in that way and to compare the qualities. So just as an example, and I think in one of the podcasts you sent, I believe it was Steve Keen, he talks about this too, as the commodity Marx talks about it's having a dual quality of it having an exchange value and a use value. One of them is what defines its price, and the other of which is, defines how you use it. So, just as an example, I used to follow David Harvey, who was is actually a urban planning academic, but got really into Marxism. And so the way that he got into it was because he was concerned that there was such a gap between the exchange value and use value of housing that it was making it, basically impossible for the average person to have a house. Just as an example. So, so I wanted to first kind of talk about, just point out the way that Marx kind of goes about his analysis, because it's pretty interesting. Like in scientific study, what you'll do is you'll do a study in the laboratory where you'll hold some variables constant, and you'll tinker with other variables, and you'll explore the dynamics of that. Obviously, you can't do that in political economy. It's impossible, right? And so, but what Marx tries to do is he tries to abstract certain concepts out, and then study them with those concepts abstracted. So just for example, he in volume 1, he's very much studying kind of the how you go from money to commodity to then the production of money. So just what I mean by that is kind of basic analysis is that you in the capitalist economy, you start with money that then you invest in the means of production and labor, and that's going to produce a product which then you sell, and then you get money prime or M prime. So this idea of MCM prime. And the first book is really focused on that. My understanding is that the second book is more focused on the realization of value. And I think the third book is focused on the distribution you can almost think of the way Marx thinks of the capitalist economy as a cycle, almost like the water cycle. So I believe the third volume looks at the system as a distribution. I haven't read 2 and 3, but 1, I think, is very much focused on looking at the dynamics of how you go from, investing that money into capital, and then creating a product that now produces more money. And so maybe I'll pause there. Just we've talked a little bit about the way that he looks at it, and kind of the general framework of MCM prime. Anything that you want to throw in there, and otherwise I can keep going on some of the important concepts that I see in Marxism.
No, I think that's really. I think you did a good job there describing the methodology, because it is so big. People, I don't think realize how complicated markets are. Big global markets and all of this stuff, and the idea of how we price goods and services, and all of the different market forces that are at work in, you can. So, what I would expand on, something that also in that Stephen Keen interview that comes up, is this whole objective, subjective conversation around valuation and just value in general. I like that they defined like what is value, and then when you start thinking from first principles about this, it really matters especially if you're going to try and govern around this stuff. And because that's the reason to do all this first principles thinking around defining terms and doing abstractions of really complicated systems, is because what Marx and the folks that tried governing this way at grand scale were doing is were deciding to put their thumb on the scale. They were really trying to say, okay, well, we as a government are going to force everybody to do X or Y, which we
Right.
think will lead to a better outcome for our people and, you know, our economic growth, all of the above, right? And so you got to do a good job when you do that abstraction. You got to be pretty damn thorough, because if you
Yeah.
miss a little subtle thing, this is what we're alluding to is this is eventually going to get to a conversation around what you hear as central planning, you know, where you've got a group of people that are trying to engineer an outcome. So they study a system and they, again, if you make any mistakes, and this is a central planning like decision is like the decision that China made around one child policy.
Right.
The implications for that up front, I think a lot of other nations were a little bit jealous of them for being able to make such a dramatic cultural change that had impacts that they wanted that allowed them to grow massively fast. But now, 50 years later, we look at it and we go, you guys have a demographic crisis ahead of you.
Right.
You have a full-on demographic crisis as a result of this policy. And now it's like, well, with the agility that you have, you painted yourself into this. It's not even painting yourself into a corner. It's something a lot bigger than that. I think this is why Karl Marx. What he was trying to do is there's a lot of genius to it, because he's not like he's saying, well, if we're going to stick our thumb on the scale, we better understand at fundamentals how these little cogs
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. And I guess that makes me think of a couple things to point out. So one is that Karl Marx, we're talking about his writings being in the mid 19th century. And so we also kind of have to understand what is his writing in response to. So just to kind of situate it, right? And it very much, I think, is in response to the works of people like Adam Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mills. Basically, I believe they're often referred to as the neoclassical economists. And so we also kind of have to understand the time frame in which it was written. What has Marx himself studied, and what is he responding to as well? So that's one point. And another point that it just made me think, and this is relevant to the earlier discussion about kind of my own intellectual framework for this all, is that as I was for many years, I've had a kind of a bias around believing more in decentralization compared to centralization. And you talked a little bit about how a lot of this leads to central planning. So it was interesting to explore Marxism while having a general biases for decentralization, because it makes you kind of see that, well, there is a dichotomy there is a difference there. And maybe the other point to make, and I think they do it well in the Stephen King, Lex Friedman podcast, just make the point that there's a difference between Marx's economic analyses and his kind of how he looks at the politics side of it. Now, of course, they're interlinked, and that's why what we now call economics was previously called political economy. But what I'm trying to get at here specifically is there's a huge difference between his works on Capital and his Communist Manifesto. Whereas Capital is, a very thorough economic analysis and criticism of the capitalist means of production, and it doesn't prescribe what to do. The Communist Manifesto, on the other hand, is very specific in terms of, how people should act and what they should do to respond to capitalism or to the current economy or to class conflict.
Right. That's good background, because I don't think I really just don't think our schools do justice to the complexities of these things. I know coming out of high school, I didn't get any of that, and college,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
me neither.
yeah, you really got to just get curious and want to go see what people are talking about. So, okay, so I'm trying to think of where the next place is to go. It's very easy to dive into a lot of that abstraction that you mentioned, those terms, how certain things are. I think in a common thread I saw happening was first sort of getting around defining what the stuff is. Like, I think we've done a pretty good job, but then this deep dive into how some of those values that are or those variables that fit into these big complicated markets, like, and defining them, and then how things played out, like as the Russians tried it and their brand of it, and all of the history of it, and I don't know that I want to go into just rehashing a bunch of stuff that you and those guys know. You know, like where? How can we take this somewhere new?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I think, okay, so
Like,
why don't we talk about a few concepts that I think are important and see where that takes us. So, so I think if we look at it from just backing out into like a very overall summary of what is Marx really getting at, and I think there's a few things we can talk about there that then we can see where we want to dive in further. So, at a holistic level, I think what we're seeing here is that Marx is, first of all, using what's very crucial to his work is the labor theory of value. And we can get into that a little bit more, but essentially it's the idea that all value comes from the labor that which is put in it. So, you know, if you're producing a certain product, the value of that product, in his view, actually comes from the labor that was put into it. And this is a view that was held by the economists like Ricardo. In fact, I believe he is the originator of the labor theory of value. So despite that Marx is criticizing, you know, their theories, he assumes the labor theory of value. And now in doing so, what Marx is saying at a very holistic level is that capitalism is naturally expansionary, because capitalists will seek to find new markets in which they can sell their product, that they innovate and compete with each other in order to reduce the price of those products and therefore sell more of them. And so therefore it's inherently expansionary. And additionally, that there are two main components of the value. One is the machines that are being used, and he calls those constant capital, and the other is the labor, and he calls that variable capital. And so in Marx's eyes, as you produce products, capitalism will use more machines to produce those products, and use less labor. And overall, they kind of sum this up as, you know, you have an increasing rate of exploitation of workers, because basically the idea is that you want to pay those workers less so that you can make money off the product that you're creating.
Yeah.
But that within
you have
that,
to, because competitors are going to use
because
those tactics
competitors are
against
there
you.
as well, right?
It's a capitalist system.
And so within that, the idea is that you will have a falling rate of profit, and that eventually capitalism will fail. So that's kind of like a very cursory overall sense of what Marx is saying is that, hey, in his analysis of it, he is saying that capitalism has inherent contradictions in its system, and that it will expand, but that it will eventually fail due to those contradictions. So now we can zoom into various parts of that, but I wanted to just lay that out at the very outset. And one area that I think is often interesting to look at is that labor theory of value, because a lot of his work is based on assuming that the labor theory of value is true.
And so in that, again, a lot of good. I really enjoyed that conversation with Stephen Keen, and I had listened to Stephen Keen debate Doomberg, who's a popular voice in macro, the green bird guy, and I did a whole episode of my show about it. I just thought it was the coolest conversation about nuclear. Like, they talked a lot about basically it was climate crisis and the energy crisis, and it was an economic pragmatist and the climate I don't want to say alarmist, but hey guys, this is important, we're screwed here if we don't do something about it. And that was Steve Keen.
And that was Keen. Okay.
Yeah, but these two guys, they it was one of the coolest, most sort of sober, well-structured, not argumentative, just conversations about that topic. So I just thought Stephen Keen really represented his case very well there. I was really impressed by it. So that's what drew me to hearing his thoughts on Marxism. Yeah. And they touched on exactly what you just mentioned, that piece of it. And I want to say he mentions that it was funny. Like, he said that there's this point at about the hour mark of that conversation where he brings up like that you can tell as you read like the second book or third book that Marx did that he was suddenly influenced by a bunch of Hegel.
Yeah, that. Or I think I think he said that happened before he wrote the Capital series. It happened in the Gundrisa. He like cited the page number.
Right. Well, then he also he contradicts the case, his own case that he made for the labor. Just because he takes into account, I think something about the
I think what he was talking about there. Tell me if I'm if I'm remembering this right. Is basically Steve Keen came to a point where he looked out on the landscape and saw these machines and these massive cranes and they're building buildings, right? Okay, but then on the other hand, he's looking at Marx, and Marx is saying that value only comes from labor. And so he saw a contradiction there of why is it that, how do you explain, how can you tell me that the machines aren't creating value, right? Is that what we're talking about here?
It was that. Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting too, because I think that a lot of Marxists, like my family, like I mentioned, my grandmother and my aunts, I think a lot of their study of and interest and passion around it comes from that first book, from the first work, where it really paints richly the criticisms and the problems with capitalism, but without all that necessary reconciliation later that talks about, well, what about these other things? And I think there are a few. Yeah, there's a few instances.
And I haven't even read those, but I did a course. I mentioned David Harvey earlier, and he has done a couple of courses where he'll it'll be basically have readings of the book, and then it's an online course, and then he kind of gives his interpretation of it. And he talks a lot about this, about how, we often will have a volume one perspective where you really need to have all three of the volumes. And so that's why I admitted up front, I don't have that kind of sense. I probably won't ever read volumes two and three, but because I
Right.
think
Well,
that
because
we can talk
it
about the
sounds like
major
you probably did a
principles.
lot of that on your own. A lot of that
Yeah.
reconciliation. It sounds like you figured out. Yeah.
Well, I want to
There's
just
a,
say a comment on that labor theory of value, or at least the contradiction that
yeah.
Steve Keen sees. Now, at the risk of challenging somebody who's way smarter than me, but when I read Capital, my interpretation was that Marx is saying that, not that a machine has no value, as Steve Keen characterizes, but rather the value of the machine actually comes from the labor that was put into making that machine. So the labor that made the machine is congealed into that machine. And it's not that the machine has no value, but that the value of the machine itself is derived from the labor. So I guess I did disagree with with Steve Keen's characterization that Marx would say that the machine has no value. But anyway, just something that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense what you're saying. Yeah, and Steve seems like a cool dude. I don't think he'd be offended. um, yeah,
But I think
so
this is so interesting because when you compare and contrast the labor theory of value with, let's say, the price discovery mechanism in a free market of supply and demand, there's a huge, like, there's something very important about that. And in the sense that if not that we're here to try to disprove or prove anything, but I think for
yeah,
me, one of the things that really is important about Marx and about, trying to understand capitalism is, if the labor theory of value is in my opinion highly questionable. And because again, it assumes that the value of anything in the economy can strictly be boiled down to the labor that was put into it. But I think that in this particular instance, the price discovery process is this kind of opaque process that actually is what determines the value of a good. It's not related to the fact that I put in X number of hours to create
yeah.
a
Me as
certain
a
product.
buyer, I don't really give a shit about any of that. It's how much do
Yeah,
I need that?
exactly. It's how much
How
do you
much do
want
I
it?
need your widget? How much do I want
Yeah,
it? How much money have I got? How rich do I feel right now? Do I
right,
feel
right.
rich or do I feel poor? You know,
Yeah.
like, because is this a need for me or is this a want? And then so there's a massive amount of psychological that's going into price discovery, and there's
Yep.
like the market. Like, is it a wide market where a lot of people can see it, or and are you a
Yeah.
forced seller? Like, are you in a hurry to
Yep.
sell? All of these things play into it, and to just with a broad stroke say we can value this all in labor, I think that was a mistake. I think there
Yeah,
was so much more of it that
I think it's a super crucial mistake, and again, you can see why, because that was the prevailing theory at the time, was that they explained the value of a good through the labor that was put into it. And I think there have been very sophisticated kind of arguments against the labor theory of value, but the simplistic way that I think about it is that, when you have a bidding process, like you said, in a transparent market, that's what determines the price of that good. So you could have put in, if you have two products, it could have taken 1,000 more hours to create this product over this product, but it is possible that this product is priced lower because nobody wants it. And
yeah.
so therefore, I mean, that in and of itself invalidates the labor theory of value. And Marx's one of his central contentions is that you have, in a capitalist mode of production, you have exploitation of the worker because of the desire to continue to produce goods at a lower price and therefore pay lower for that labor that's then congealed into that good, um, well, exploitation is based on that labor theory of value, but if the labor theory of value is false, then it actually can't help us understand if we do believe there is exploitation. In my opinion, it doesn't help explain it.
Yeah. So it occurs to me right here, before we go into digging into any more concepts like that,
Yeah.
what I do want to skip ahead for a second. What's your holistic view after studying this so much? Like, what do you think about all this now?
Yeah.
And you get to change your mind tomorrow, critically.
No, okay,
Like, I
yeah,
won't
for
hold
sure.
you to it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
today, as we sit here, we talk about some of these things. I think that'll help me kind of understand a
Yeah.
little bit better, like how
Well,
to approach.
I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I almost think that these systems, in a way, they don't exist. So like, so what I mean by that is that the economy is so complicated, and it is a series of decisions that have been made over time that acknowledge and value certain things. Like, for example, I think it's fair to say that our economy, let's say in the United States, it values the ability to be entrepreneurial, or to basically create a product and to sell it in the market without being stopped, or be, unfettered or less fettered ability to do that, right?
Right.
And and so what I'm trying to say is that, like, you can boil that down to saying, oh, this is a capitalist system, and you can kind of say like, oh, well, it's capitalist because it you put money into creating a good, but like, I think it's much more complicated than that, because so in the same way that, let's say Marxist thinking would boil down capitalism to this pure desire to make money and to, be greedy, in the same way that, let's say, a self-proclaimed free marketeer might kind of criticize Marxism as this, like, uh, you know, um, socialist paradise where everybody is helping each other and there's no conflict. They're both abstractions that, in a way, don't exist. So I'm sure I'm not doing it justice, but like, what both sides have done is they've taken complicated systems and reduced them to kind of one word, and none of that actually exists. We have this very complicated system. You'll often hear Marxists say like, well, it's not true that people are simply rational beings, because if you really watch them, look how much they share with each other, right? Or, and if on the other side again, you might say, well, socialism is impossible because you can't trust each other, right?
Like,
It's not
sharing can be
possible.
rational.
It should, yeah, sure, yeah. But my point is that these are abstractions, and so in a way, I believe that they almost don't exist. But I think, to answer your question more clearly, um, I think that a lot of this, in my opinion, what you believe in relates to what is your fundamental outlook on life. And I almost come to the kind of view that if you have a sense of uh, optimism, then you're almost less likely to kind of um, view things from a Marxist perspective. Whereas if you have a little bit more of a pessimistic perspective, and of course this is, everybody changes throughout their life, I think you're more likely to maybe view things as Marxist, because what a lot of Marx does is kind of looking at the system and criticizing it. And this almost reminds me of what Jordan Peterson says, where he says, well, you should clean your own room first, and like stop worrying about what's kind of going on out there. Clean your own room first. And so I will say that like that does resonate with me because I found it less and less helpful to look externally and make kind of aggressive and broad criticisms of the way that the world works
And judgments.
when, yeah, when I can't control it or really do much about it except basically control my own behavior around it. So
Right.
so yeah, I am for the reasons I described earlier around why the labor theory of value doesn't make sense, why that's the crux of kind of Marx's theories and his thoughts, but then also backing out and my general perspective on the world. I don't think that I don't identify as much with Marxist thinking as I did before, except to say that I think that it is still important. Like despite the fact that I want to look more at cleaning my own room, I think it's important that we kind of have different ways of thinking about things and different perspectives on them. So anyway, I don't know if that
Yeah.
answers your question, but
No, it does. That's great. It's really helpful to try and. Well, I mean, so I've never. As I was again sort of gearing up for a conversation on Marxism, I didn't really look at it through that lens, the whole optimist pessimist lens, and I can kind of see that. But I mean, I might push back a little bit that I think like I think it's good to reflect, and criticism can sort of be looked at
yeah,
through that lens. Like you can like look at criticism as a, now if criticism is not like I don't think it's super productive when criticism is you guys are doing it wrong and you guys should all be
right,
doing this and this and I'm
right,
right and you're wrong, and like that's not useful criticism. But like productive criticism, we're like, now
yeah,
why are we doing this, and what
right,
this
yeah,
outcome, like, so that's where when I look at Karl Marx's work as a, could we be doing better than what we're doing?
yeah, yeah,
And I almost went into this thinking, well, is this going to be a conversation? Because, the first video I went and watched, I told you, I went and watched this guy, Richard
Richard
Wolff.
Wolff,
And
yeah,
it was somebody my aunt recommended that I check
okay,
out. And so I went and listened to him, but I found like almost none of his arguments really, there wasn't any substance to any of the arguments
yeah,
for
agreed.
Marxism that I heard him bring up. Like he brought up like, he brought up a
I
lot
don't
of.
think he's. I'm convinced he's never read it. So yeah,
Well, that would be. Well, I think he teaches it. So
yeah,
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I really didn't know much about the guy, but I listened to him talk, and I did what I do with everybody. I let them say it all, and then I
yeah,
tried to look for anything, but I like most of his critiques of capitalism came to, it's not fair. And he brought
yes,
up
yeah,
examples of like, do you like, is it okay that a parking attendant makes more money than a childcare worker? And I'm like, well,
hmm,
on the surface, you can be like, no, that's not fair. But then, is there a market for like the childcare worker
hmm,
has the same opportunities to be a parking attendant? Like,
yeah,
we're not in shortage of that. The market creates the pricing structure there. And
right,
if people don't find sitting around staring at parked cars very rewarding, they won't do that job, and they'll want to go work with kids. You know what I mean? So
hmm,
markets, when I listened to all of his arguments came down to, wow, life's not fair,
yeah,
kind of, is what I
yeah,
felt like. And it's like, well, when I think of capitalism is just kind of pure nature. It's like, let's take all of the wheels off or let's take all of the rails off, and let's do this like the Lion King,
hmm,
where
hmm,
and where it's the circle of life, kill or be killed, and
yeah,
everybody's part of a big system that like I forget what it is. I've just watched a lot of Lion King. I've got to.
okay,
I've got a 7-year-old, and this is the
Oh,
one movie she's really
I thought it was
liking.
your interest.
I can see why you'd think that, but yeah, I'm going to blame this one on her. She, we've watched it a few times, and I was struck by, and actually a good buddy of mine. I was talking. Somehow this topic came up. It's been on my mind lately, and he just said, "Yeah, it's like capitalism's like nature," and I'm like, "Yeah, it is. It's ruthless. I mean, there is there is a part of that where I can see why we look at it and we go, man, that's ruthless. It's cold. Like people want to say they want to look at the whole the Wall Street take." Where you go to that Matt, what's his name from Wall Street, that 80s movie. It's like greed is good.
Gordon Gekko.
Gordon Gekko. Greed is good.
Yeah.
Like most of the critics of capitalism, that is their entire picture of it. It's just like a bunch of people who want all of the money, and when they got a big pile of money, they want another pile of money to put with it.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly true. That's not actually. I would say that's totally that's a part of it. That's a dynamic that's at work. But it's like what capitalism is something that's more close to. Well, I would say it's kind of written into the the rules engine of this universe we're riding in. Is we have this system that works with our biological evolution. All of it is influenced by this like checks and balances where incentives drive outcomes. And with capitalism, you just kind of have this pure like you know, the lion tearing apart the deer, and it's bloody and gruesome in parts, and that's undeniable. But then the thing is it's really effective at driving evolution and progress and
Innovation. Right.
Innovation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because when you take those controls off and you say, okay, two or more parties will compete and there's no holds barred for outcome, you will get more imaginative solutions and you will get all those benefits. Now, this is where I was a little surprised, like as I was listening to Stephen King explain it to Lex. I was struck by the fact that, and through this view, this fourth turning lens, that we're at a place where a purely there are times in history where capitalist systems did fail. Like the haves, especially like in a feudal system where he's describing what it was like when there was where there was the ruling class was like royalty, and you know, when the gap gets too far between the haves and the have-nots, because nature's been really kicking ass, if you get a group of people together and you get them cranky enough about the negative outcomes they're experiencing in that brutal system, they tend to band together and say, well, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to use whatever power we can to go take away whatever advantage you have. Now, that can lead to something like Marxism as a whole. And then Marxism gets tried, and then a purely capital nature system reasserts itself, and the balances of the scale, and it's kind of like, I love the beautiful complexity of it all. And I think I love to just watch the observation of it. And the place I am in now is I'm just watching a beautiful game play out that has such complexity, and there's so many moving parts, and there's so many pieces of it. And I would never want to try and be a central planner in it. You know, like that.
I agree.
It's gotten, but I'm not. But here's the thing: I'm not going to say that it's just purely wrong, because when capitalism runs amok for long enough, and the have-nots get cranky enough, they're going to pick up a stick and throw it at you.
Right. I think it's a good point. Yeah. It's a great point.
And then the wheel continues. You know?
Right. And we've definitely seen that. I mean, specifically in the 20th century, we've seen that play out where, just by example, around the 1930s, you had the Depression and you had this kind of real shift in American policy towards, you know, um, progressivism, and some would describe it as socialism through the New Deal, right? And then you
Hmm.
go up until the 70s, and you start to see up until the Volcker shock, right? That's kind of consistent, but then you have the Volcker shock where the interest rates go up really high, and it's almost like a disciplining on labor. So you can definitely see that pattern. And in fact, like, just going back to Marx and making the point that, we've talked a lot about the way that he looks at it through the lens of his book Capital, but we can never kind of forget about the fact that his other works, his other political works, which go from criticizing capitalism to now saying, well, the way that we can have a solution for it is through ownership of the means of production, and that we would go through a phase of socialism, and that then we can achieve communism, whereby the state no longer needs to own the means of production, and people have become classless, and we're in a utopia. And I think that's important to talk about, because that's really where we get into these formulations of Marxism as being focused around central planning and around kind of eliminating the ability for an individual to have and own a private enterprise and to pursue the creation of products that other people might want or need. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, an idea occurred to me in what you just said there. One thing I also wanted to point out, too, that I don't think is talked about enough when I hear these conversations, is the geopolitical situation at the place that tried a certain. So,
Right.
like, a lot of times we'll just say, well, capitalism won over Marxism because the Russians did it a certain way where they skipped the step you're talking about. They didn't do any capitalism, and they just went right to the state owns everything, divvies it up. There's no innovation. We're going to stamp out the same thing over and over and over again. And so, I mean, it was a flawed approach from the get-go, and it wasn't exactly what was argued for. It wasn't the complete picture. It was the Russians' spin on it, and they
Sure,
were.
sure.
And then you also have like this situation where, so China is arguably doing something like you're describing, where they're doing this kind of hybrid where they go through and they manage a capitalist system, and they get this incredible growth, and then
Right. Oh,
and then they can
yeah.
transition.
This
Go
reminds
ahead.
me of a really interesting point in Marxism, is that one of the things that he says is that in order to achieve socialism, you actually first have to have capitalism. So anyway, it's interesting because, yeah, the Chinese kind of did this a little bit in reverse, where they were a socialist system, and then in the 1970s, I think under Deng Xiaoping, they specifically became a capitalist economy, right? With various, like, you could say that they did close off their economy in certain ways, but they basically started to incentivize private enterprise, and so that today they describe themselves as communism with Chinese characteristics. And I believe they also say that by something like 2050, they want to transition into away from capitalism. So it is kind of interesting, but it's funny that you also say this about the Russians, because people who are self-described Marxists will often talk about this, that, well, really know if we don't really know that socialism or Marxism doesn't work because the Russians did X, Y, and Z wrong, or whatever, as a way to kind
Yeah.
of justify it. But I think that these examples, what do they really show us? I mean, I think they show us that it's very clear that in order to, first of all, to use um, things efficiently, to allocate resources efficiently, central planning does not work. That you have to have a market economy that defines production through the price discovery process and through understanding the like how much of a certain product is actually being used out in the market. And so
Yeah.
that kind of signal is lost in any sort of central planning or any sort of economy where the state owns all of the means of production.
But it
Um,
comes with its cons. It comes with drawbacks.
yeah,
It's like you lose so much agility in being able to do things like a central planning has this agility. Like you can coordinate radical,
yes, yeah,
massive things like
right,
huge public works projects and stuff like that
yeah.
with long visions that
But
just
that's
aren't
more from a
possible.
political standpoint, though, as opposed, right?
Right.
Like in the
Yeah.
sense that like they're only able to do that if we just take the Chinese economy. I would argue that they're only able to. First of all, they went from an agrarian poor country to now
Yeah.
implementing
In like
free
30 years.
enterprise, yeah, to now having a ton of wealth so that they can on the political side kind of use that in a central way. But it's still kind of right. But if you look at the way that that wealth was created, it
Yeah.
wasn't through using Marxist ideas. It was really through using, capitalist ideas of free enterprise and private property.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and with China also, and I'm distracted by the thought, and I don't know how this fits into the conversation, but I feel like they took a hell of a gamble, and it's so impressive what they got done in such a short amount of time. And
Yeah.
it's no wonder that the people who live there aren't, that they're very happy with their government. Like the West has the United States and Europe tends to have this view that they're almost being oppressed because they're part of this system. But from their
Right.
view, I mean, they came. If you look at China in like the late '70s compared to now, no wonder the
Right.
people are. They're kind of like, yeah, we get that you guys have kind of an attitude about us, but I got my kids going to a great school. I got
Yeah.
a couple cars in the garage. And I grew up in a
Yeah.
house that was 12 by 12 with my, 8 brothers and sisters. And we got to eat meat once a quarter,
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and it's like, so there's this thing where China, they've made this epic trajectory of progress. But I think just my macro take is you didn't get in order for them to meet their 2050 objective of going full utopian, they needed to get the flywheel going on their consumer-driven economy, which they never did. And so, like when people are really worried about China, escalations of tensions with the West and with Taiwan situation and all that, I'm like, man, but they are so screwed if we cut ties, if we really and this deglobalization that everybody talks about, I'm just like, how is China, like China isn't set up to buy all its own goods.
Right.
And there's a bunch of, other reasons to look at why I don't think we need to be as worried about that as everybody seems to
Yeah.
be. But just from a philosophical sense of how their attempt to make their brand, their flavor, a Marxist
Yep.
governance. And then there's a whole bunch of constraints around these nations around like, just where they're at on the map, their geographic, the geopolitical stability of their borders. They're, like the United States after World War II had a whole bunch of ridiculous advantages over all the other nations. Yeah. So, and there's a reason that the United States came out of that as the reserve currency, being sort of in the unipolar force in the world. So when we just take this kind of, we make this just broad dismissal of anything but capitalism, I think it's a little, I just think it ignores some of these other things. And I think that, so I guess all of that is a roundabout way to say, I actually think it can be healthy to remain critical of our capitalist system and to look at it. But I just think we have to be really careful about, because whenever you go to these, whenever you try and put your thumb on the scale in favor to try and make an outcome that's more favorable, because, and I think a lot of these people are doing it from a place of real compassion. Like it's coming from a place in their heart where they're like, no, people are starving over here. And then you got this one over here with the, ridiculous opulence. And it's like, how do we, what's the way that doesn't break everything that kind of evens it out?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that. Like one is with regard to China, I think this illustrates the point of how these terms, capitalism and Marxism, like in a way they don't exist, because all you really have is a series of decisions and policies that govern how something actually works. And so if there are 100 different policies, then maybe you could do something where you say, well, if you have 80 of these decided in a certain way, then that's capitalism or whatever, right? So that's just one point, is that like there are different ways, these systems have certain things that overlap and certain things that don't. Like with the Chinese system, probably one of the core things that you could say that they changed was to enable free enterprise, right? And the private ownership of your goods. So that was a huge thing that I think created an engine for the economy. Additionally, I think what's interesting about the Chinese experiment is that I think the economy is very much, driven based off decentralized production of goods, right? And private ownership of those things. However, then what they're able to do is kind of create a narrative around how they are communists and how they are kind of looking for the goods of everyone to create a authoritarian state that can then maintain very significant centralized power. And so I think it's an interesting combination. And to your earlier point, like they can shift on a dime, make big investments, like what is the one road or the one belt initiative.
Yeah, the Belt Road.
The Belt Road initiative. Yeah. Things that are harder in a country like the U.S., which is we can say capitalist, but also is democratic and not authoritarian. So it's I don't know. I find it really difficult to kind of characterize all of these things, and I'm interested in looking at the kind of the specific things that are different. And I think that helps a lot more often than using the individual term around it. But yeah.
Yeah. I think going into this conversation and now in this conversation, it's just further confirmation that this is just so hard. It's so
really hard.
It's so big. That's why, like, I messaged you before, like a little earlier today. I'm like, wow, you just brought up on a whim Marxism, but that is like, is huge. That is like the everything, most complicated thing, like how we govern nations, and then the trying to score them against each other, and is just so hard. There's so many things that go into all of it, and so I love that you suggested it. And I think it could take many episodes to try and like really explore it, but it's wildly fascinating, and I think it's something that just never lands. I think it's appealing to think that we're going to be able to declare a winner, and I think this whole exercise convinced me that we're just going to keep trying stuff. And my holistic view of all this is it's nature. It's hard coded into us to try a whole bunch of different stuff. Somebody was talking about on a podcast, Michael Ippolito from Blockworks. He brought up this analogy around America, how he loves America. Like he was talking about the tribalism of crypto, and how he was saying how he likes that there are a lot of options. And I think that's a really that's the right perspective. He says he loves America. He loves that it is his legitimately his favorite one of all the countries, but he like unabashedly. But he says if we were all America, he wouldn't feel that way. He says like one of the reasons it works is there is like all these different ways of doing it, and I think that's a wise view, and I think that there is so many there's just so many variables and so many factors to all of these things. It's great that we're trying all these different approaches, and the minute we all say, and going back to like Richard Wolff, and a lot of folks that want to say Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, they're evil. I think an important point they're missing is arbitrage. And because we don't live in a system where there is just one way and there's just one country, because like Michael Ippolito says, there's a lot of different countries, because we live in this world where we're trying all these different things all over the place, it means if you try something, if you go all in on something like Russian communism after World War II, if you become committed, if you double down on a system that is flawed, somebody will arbitrage it. Somebody, and this is where the folks, I think, that are committed to that, like the Bernie Sanders of the world, are what they're missing is, well, in Bernie Sanders' case, let's remove all the incentives from businesses to innovate here in this country. So they're just going to go elsewhere. And then he misses that we the way we would pay for all of the give everybody a free check for their kids to go to whatever university they want, misses the fact that we pay for that with taxes, and we're running an 8% deficit, and we're not even in a recession right now. We're in a legit debt spiral, and like the global GDP is like 250% debt to GDP. You want to say, like the deeply compassionate people want to say, you corporate Gordon Geckos are so evil, but you're missing the fact that that's how we pay for it all. And it's like, sure, Bernie's not going to take away your Social Security, but never mind the fact that the Gen Xers and everybody below them are not going to see a dime of that. It's all that Social Security is going for boomers. And so you're going to say, okay, I'm not going to take away that. I'm going to keep taxing the young people to pay for all those entitlements of the aging population, and I'm going to chase away all the people that bring in the tax revenues. It's just like, at some point you have to say, this isn't, it's not a lack of compassion, it's pragmatism. It's how do you pay for this thing you want? And you have to look at the geopolitical implications of a change you're going to make, and you have to go, am I going to get arbitraged if I just gut our progress like that? Can the United States really just go on if they were to make that investment? Never mind the fact that the university education might not be really getting your kid a distinct advantage over the kid next door if everybody has that exact same piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean, this does get into the elements of Marxism because it is so large. We've obviously talked about a few components, but it does get into the pieces of it that I am more critical of, which is the aspect of it that is basically advocating for a class conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And that then, so basically the idea is that capitalism will ultimately results in the exploitation of the worker, will continually result in the exploitation of the worker until there will be a massive, class conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And in doing so, we'll have a period of state ownership, and then we'll usher in, a classless society. And I think that, in one way at its core is that it does promote the idea that class conflict should exist, or that we should divide along class lines. And so I think that Marxism also promotes, conflict in a society, right? Like, so one thing that I think is interesting is if you compare, for example, Buddhist philosophy to Marxist philosophy, just in one angle, like in Buddhist philosophy, it accepts that, people do have, like, life is unfair, or people do have different classes or things like that. And obviously, like, one of the beauties of America is that you can, if you work hard, you can shed some of those differences, right, and kind of overcome some of these challenges. And I think that's really important. But going into the kind of Bernies of the world, I think that they're using elements of Marxism and the elements of it that I think are not very helpful. Like, the elements of it that I think are helpful are when you talk about analyzing the economy and being critical of the way the system works and understanding how it works. But when you start getting into the basically promotion of a class conflict, and that is a way to usher in a utopia, I think you start to get into the really, I would say, ridiculous and fictional aspects of Marxism, and that really produce, I think, bad outcomes overall. And one of the things that I think is interesting also is that for the people who advocate for kind of redistribution or like state ownership, I would like to see them donate their own money first, right? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, for those people who are advocating for these wide-scale systemic changes and reallocation of property, you never see them actually do that for themselves. Like, are they giving away their extra money that they have to their neighbor? I don't think so, right? So in a lot of ways, it is.
Well, they're going to tell you they're not part of the problem. They're not the,
right.
They're the have-nots. Everybody thinks they're a have-not.
Yeah, it gets into the
but that's not always
demagoguery. Yeah.
Right. Fascinating subject.
It's a huge one. It's something that I think it's important just to contend with it and talk about it, right? I mean, I love that you had me on to talk about it. It's probably overly ambitious, but I thought, why don't we just give it a go?
it's a good go, and we might come back to it. At one of these future, all of you guys that agree to come do this show with me, you're just the coolest, and I'm going to just keep asking you. I'll keep coming up with reasons to do it. So why don't we? I tell you what. Let's put a pin in solving global governance. There. Let's transition it a little bit to crypto. So you were originally,
Okay, yeah.
I think you brought up the first time we met, talking about how you saw parallels in the Marxist view community, like supporters, and the Bitcoiners, the laser-eyed Bitcoiners, the maxis.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Let me try to talk about that. So, yeah, I see parallels between the hardcore Marxists, and these are people who are self-described, I would say, the hardcore kind of Ayn Rand crowd, let's call them, like the libertarians, let's say, and then also the Bitcoin maxis. And I think like the similarity that I see between all of them is that all of them see the world, they look out exteriorly at the world and say that this is the way that the world should be. So for the Marxists, they say that the world should be a place where there is no wealth gap, where everybody is happy and sharing with each other, right? I mean, just kind of like crudely summarizing.
Utopian.
Yeah, it's utopian. But similarly, in the Ayn Rand crowd, they kind of look at the world and see that, well, the world is a place where everybody should be laser focused on doing business and working in a free market economy and creating products and not worrying about helping each other, just doing everything for self-interest, and that is the way to make the world a better place. Okay, and the Bitcoin Maxi says that the way the world should be is that you should have a hard money like Bitcoin, and that's going to solve everything. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that I see this parallel of basically, again, they're all utopian in my perspective. And I think that despite the fact that they would strongly, that the Rand crowd and the Bitcoin Maxi crowd are very similar, but they would say that they're very different from the Marxist crowd. And they are, in the sense that one believes in free markets, one doesn't. But I think they both hold this perspective, this utopian perspective, that makes them more similar than, in my opinion, than they might think they are. Does that, I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation, I'd say. Also that, well, so, I don't know. My thoughts, the Bitcoiners, the Austrian School of Economics, right? So the hard money people, that's how I see them. And I see I see them that way too, yeah. Right. And it's like, I think a really valuable skill to develop in self that kind of comes along in your middle age is kind of realizing that everybody's right and everybody's wrong. Yeah. So there are elements of like Austrian economics that are right, but there are other huge problems with it. This actually, Stephen Keen, this came up towards the middle of that conversation with Lex, where he was talking about, I lost train of thought. Yeah, if I remember right, he was basically talking about Schumpeter, and in contradistinction to Austrian economists, whereas the Austrian economists are really focused on
how you shouldn't expand the money supply, but Schumpeter showed that while he took a lot of the tenets of Austrian economics, showed that that it is good to expand the money supply further. Is that the part that you're
Yeah,
talking about?
yeah,
Okay.
it is, but it's really big because
Yeah.
that notion right there is huge. Like
I
it's
mean, we
like
talked about it a lot in our last conversation, but looking at it from the angle of Perry Mehrling and versus Austrian economics, right? And how
right.
should you have an expanding money supply or not? And then also bringing in the MMT perspective. So yeah, it's a huge topic too.
It's a huge one, but it's like but it's a boy, it's a cool one. The idea is
Yeah.
that like all of the magic comes from creation of money.
Right.
And there's this really cool part of that conversation with Lex and Keen where they're talking about what is money, the distinction between assets and liabilities, like as a
Yeah.
bank thinks about them,
Yeah.
and how you get so much massive expansion in innovation and growth and progress generally and quality of life. Let's say let's make it not just about making money. Let's make it about just quality of life. Improvements happen when you can create more of the intangible third party stuff that we trade our goods in. And so what I think the Austrian schools are missing is that very, very, very critical, important bit. And again, if you just totally go whole hog on something like the hard money view, and you close your ears, to no, you need to be able to create capital so that you can lend it and let people try things to innovate. And here's the thing, arbitrage. Like if you don't make room for that somewhere, they are going to make room for that, and they are going to out innovate you, and then you're screwed again. So it's like, so I have this very, I don't know, pragmatic view of, so here's the thing, like I won't bet against Bitcoin or the Bitcoiners. And I think they're largely, like a lot of how they build their view is missing huge parts of how economies work. And
Agreed.
but I think that because if you're going to transition to a decentralized financial system that runs entirely on software, in a decentralized way, you have exploits and smart contract risk, and you have all of these vectors for attacks that you need safe harbors. So you need,
like just because they may be wrong about their holistic view on the economy, it doesn't mean that number won't go up.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't mean and it's not a bad thing for number to go up. Like we need we need a bunch of people to well, we need a bunch of people to sort of go hard money, hardcore. Like that's the only answer.
We do, yeah.
They make a thing like Bitcoin possible, which is gold.
That's true.
Like you need something analogous to gold, because I think historically, while you had all these nation states fighting each other and smashing each other's money, devaluing it, managing it irresponsibly, you needed like a way for families to kind of like protect their assets. And now we've got this cool new one that can now move borders, that has all these cool innovations over gold. And those of us that are kind of forward looking and can just look at, gold served a very useful function, and that's why it lasted for thousands of years, because it was that thing that everybody could kind of, put a few percent of their assets in that they could run with if they needed to. And then in World War II, like as Germany as the Reich took over and all that, and you had the exodus of people leaving, and then but then they couldn't leave with their like, if you turned it all to gold, they'd just stop you at the border and say, well, you can leave, but we're going to keep that gold right here.
Yeah.
Now we've got this new innovation that works. All we got to do is get everybody to agree that it's gold. Boom.
Yeah.
Once you do that, now we have something we can package in as a financial tool that sits on that software layer that's going to run the global economy and our financial system. But now if, let's say, the leading smart contract platform has some 0-day exploit, everybody's not just broke. And there's a way that you can... So I think that Bitcoin survives, does well. I don't think it's going to grow like most of the other stuff from here on out. But if you want just a good, boring asset, all it has to do is be that, you know, and that's why. So
I personally hope it'll be a little bit more exciting to the upside, but yeah, no, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and you know, I think this kind of goes, if we were to almost try to summarize things in a way. We talked about, or at least, you know, we talked about Marxism and the Bitcoin maxis and the way that they're more similar. I think there's an interesting point there, which is that on the one hand, you kind of need these zealots who are driving forward a certain perspective because it challenges the status quo so much that may be the only way to get the average person to think about it. But on the other hand, if you're trying to understand the world better, then it's better to see the parallels between those and to be, as you say, you know, try to be more of the weatherman to see how do these things interact and how can I actually understand the world better. Because I think that if you choose to be the zealot, if you choose to be the Bitcoin maxi or the maxi Marxist, I don't think that you're actually going to understand the world better. And so, you know, it just depends on what your goal is.
I agree. I think you said that really well. Yeah. It's like, I don't know how you box that up though and communicate the value of that. I think you're really lucky if you see that. And then what's so cool about it too is you don't have to be critical. Like I'm not really, because when you decide that there's only one path forward and that there's only one answer to these problems, and then you commit to it, and then you decide you need to get to a place where, like what we were talking about in the beginning, where you wear the t-shirt and you join the team, and now you have to be a defender of everything they think. You just, you introduce so much conflict into, like, I'm not mad at all at anything any of these people say. Like, I find it all very entertaining, what all of the maxis and their whole conversation, but it is such an unfair advantage as like an investor if you just don't, hey, I'm not on it. I have no team affiliations. Right. I'm going to zoom out and watch y'all play. And then I'm just going to see where there's logical bets to make based on all of your turmoil. I think that's the way to do it.
As an investor and maybe as a citizen too, right?
Well, yeah. Like, let's take away just the economic incentives from doing it. It does lead to... like, I never feel compelled to, oh, you said something about my project, or you said something about my political, this is such a zen place to be in. And it's interesting because Marx was kind of, the dialectic thing he was doing where he was looking at both. Yeah. When you can see both sides of any conflict and you weigh the pros and cons of sort of polar opposites, when you can sit on that spectrum and just look at it, that's kind of in a sense what we're talking about, and that's Marx doing that. You know?
Yeah, he certainly does it in his assessment, of the economy. But interestingly enough, he drops that when he goes into the Communist Manifesto. So maybe what we can say is take a Capital Volume 1 approach to things.
Yeah, I like it. What question? What was the order of operations? So he had his 3 books, and then when did the Communist Manifesto happen? I don't know that piece of it.
Oh, I'd have to look. I'd have to look that up. I'm not entirely sure of the order of events, but I think, yeah, I would guess that the Communist Manifesto came at least after Volume 1 because
That
as
makes
I
sense to me.
again as I understand it, volumes 2 and 3 were more put together from his writings that he had when he after he died, and Engels,
Got
who
it.
was his benefactor. Which there's an interesting part here, which is that Friedrich Engels, who was his benefactor, was a very rich industrialist, and I believe also uh, a very well, basically, he was a really rich industrialist who supported Marx in his work. So it's kind of an interesting contradiction, perhaps you could say.
Buddy, this was a cool conversation. Thank you for coming up
Yeah,
with this
well,
idea and joining me in
thanks for
doing
having me
this.
on. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me
man.
on.
For sure. Be thinking about the next one
All right,
because I'm going to call
I'll
you.
think. I'll pick something a little bit easier.
Nah. All right. Let's wrap it up here.
All
That's
right.
about the 2-hour mark. Hirsch, thank you so much. Viewers, listeners, subscribers, thank you for being here and joining us on this, and thank you for doing all those things. And we'll be back soon. Thank you so much. All
See
right.
you, everyone.
Now it's coming around, you're feeling cut down and in the ground, and so we all come together. We making a sound, we sing. Look at all this love we found. Gotta raise some more toast to the sweet life. I feel strong, I wanna be right. See the sun giving me the green light. Kick back, relax, and soak up the sweet sights. Take me to the ocean, take me to the sea. Wash away